Welcome, friends, to the informative presentation by Dr. Robert Gegear, made possible by the generous support of the Battelle Institute and Pilgrim Bank Foundation, gifts to the Friends of Holly Hill Farm, our nonprofit. Dr. Gegear is an assistant professor of biology at UMass Dartmouth, and his research includes an incredible list: conservation of native pollination systems, neuroecology of plant pollinator interactions, multimodal sensory integration, floral evolution, and bumblebee ecology. His work has been followed by Jasmine Callahan, who is the Conservation and Sustainability Director here at Holly Hill Farm in Cohasset, our nonprofit, where we grow certified organic produce, herbs, and flowers, and have a successful education program at the farm and with 40 area schools when it's not COVID-19, might I say. Dr. Gegear will invite questions after his presentation, so please mute yourselves except when asking a question, as we have a large audience today. And thank you all, and welcome, Dr. Gegear.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. This is the first Zoom presentation. I'm used to walking around and getting some exercise while I do this. So sitting in a chair, we'll see how things go. It should go well. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about the connection between pollinators and biodiversity. When you hear the term pollinator, I think many of you probably think of the connection between pollinators and food productivity. So pollinators play an important role in putting food on our table, but they also play an equally important role in maintaining biodiversity and ecosystem function. So the connection between pollinators and food productivity has received a considerable amount of attention since colony collapse disorder in honeybees. But the connection between pollinators and biodiversity really has been neglected. And globally, we're seeing reductions, loss of biodiversity, and so we really need to start acting now before we start to lose some of the connections that are keeping this biodiversity, sustaining biodiversity. So in this people-pollinator-biodiversity connection, the one thing that's missing, if I could add a word, it would be plants. So pollinator by itself, we tend to think of it as an animal, typically a bee. But when we talk about biodiversity, we really need to add the plant component, so pollinator-plant biodiversity connection. And hopefully at the end of the talk today, you're going to see that connection, what we're trying to do to figure out what's going on with those connections and how you can help to restore those connections. So to give you a general overview of what I want to talk about today, I'm going to start off by giving background content, a little bit of background content. So what is a pollination system versus a pollinator, and why is it important in this ecological context? The second, then I'm going to shift and focus on what exactly is the problem and how do we solve it. So I think within the pollinator decline issue, there are two main problems, or two faces to the pollinator decline issue. As I mentioned, one is the role of pollinators in agricultural context, and I'll be focusing more and contrasting that with the role of pollinators in more of an ecological context. So, again, focused on these pollination systems that I'll talk about in a minute. And then my research program, a little bit what I'm doing to help the situation and what I've termed data-driven ecological conservation. So that's going out, figuring out who are the threatened species, what do they need, and what are we doing to them to cause their decline. And I'll introduce the Ecology Project, which is a citizen science project I started about 5 years ago now. It's helped out tremendously to figure out the ecological needs of these threatened species, and I'm hoping that you'll want to join the program. I'll talk a bit about that later. And then finally, what is it that you can do at home? So it could be in your garden, if you had a conservation land, if you are in a space committee for a town. There are different things that you can do to help to restore and protect biodiversity. So collecting data, restoring, and then also what I hope you get, and I give workshops to help this because it's a fairly involved topic, and here we're focused more on the issues, but how is it that you assess the habitat? How do you know that your habitat or your garden is doing what it's supposed to? So there are a lot of plant lists out there that tell you, here's what you need to plant for pollinators. And I'll show you that those plants are, for the most part, a bit misleading. They're not targeting threatened species. They're certainly going to bring things that pollinate animals into your garden, but they're not helping out the animals that need it. So I'm going to talk a bit about how you can assess your habitat and then also improve it, and then look to see if the change actually made a difference when it comes to threatened species. So it's basically, what is the goal of the conservation action? So to start things off, a bit of background. I'm sure you've all heard the term pollinator before, and it's used so much that the definition is really, people are missing the true importance of the term pollinator. People tend to apply it to animals, mostly bees, often honeybees, which are certainly pollinators and important. But the term pollinator itself is actually a plant-based term, and it's related to plant reproduction, and specifically reproduction in flowering plants. So if we look at this simplified diagram, like us, plants, there's a female component and a male component. So female structures and male structures. The male structures is called the stamen. The female is called the carpel. The male gametes are contained in pollen. So the pollen is the equivalent to the sperm. What happens is that the pollen is released and it attaches to the stigma, which is the surface of the female reproductive structure. We get a pollen tube growing down and we get fertilization taking place. We then get development of seeds and fruit, and those are released, and then we get continuation of the cycle. So when the pollen lands in the stigma and we get fertilization taking place leading to seed development, that process is called pollination. And so in the simplified diagram, we can see that in order for that to take place, if we had some wind or we were to shake the flower, the pollen would drop down on the stigma. It's a very simplified system. And we would get the pollen tube growing down and fertilization taking place. But this poses a major problem. That is that the plant is effectively mating with itself. And what that does is reduces the amount of genetic variation. And plants and animals, what genetic variation does is it allows you to become more resilient to environmental change. So if there's a new disease introduced, it's a timely topic, or if we change the environment in some way, the genetic variability gives us flexibility in terms of our offspring and whether they could survive in those altered environments. So what happens in the vast majority of plants then is that they want their pollen to be transferred. So that's called self-pollination. And there are some plants are what it's called self-compatible. So if they get their own pollen, they can lead to fertilization. As I said, there's a cost to that, and it's called inbreeding depression. And many plants, though, or the vast majority, are what's called self-incompatible. If they get their own pollen, that doesn't lead to fertilization, so it doesn't lead to a pollination event. And interestingly, some plants are initially self-incompatible and then they become self-compatible, and that's a fail-safe mechanism. So if they don't receive pollen from another plant, they will still be able to reproduce and get seeds into the environment to continue on in that way. So the vast majority of plants, though, want this outcrossing where the pollen is moved to another individual of the same species, preferably an individual that isn't related. Now, if the pollen is transferred to the flower, the stigma of another plant species, you can think of it as you're trying to mate with another species. That doesn't work, and you're effectively wasting your male gametes. So that's one cost to this plant, to the donor plant. The recipient plant, what happens is that heterospecific pollen, or the pollen from the other plant species, clogs or blocks the surface of the stigma and prevents it from receiving its own pollen, which would lead to a fertilization event. So there's a cost on the male and the female side of reproduction. So there's been strong selection on the plants to maximize this outcrossing. And so if I want to move my pollen from this plant, and this is my target plant, this is who I want to mate with, obviously plants can't run around and find a mate like animals can. most animals. And so to solve this, some plants use the wind or use water. But the problem with that is if your mate is upwind and your pollen's going downwind, it's not a very efficient strategy. Similarly, if you want to mate with somebody upstream and you put your pollen in the water, it's flowing downstream, it's not a very efficient system. So there are some plants that do this, plant species. The vast majority use animals to try to target the pollen and get them to outcross. So any animal that transfers pollen that leads to fertilization is called a pollinator. Now, certainly animals can go from this plant to this plant. And if they do, it's not going to lead to a pollination event. So, you know, that's going to be a cost, and that animal would not be considered a pollinator. And this point becomes extremely important, again, as we connect the pollinators to biodiversity. So if we flip things and look at these animals, these flower visitors, there are many animals, so they're nectarivores and pollinivores that feed on flower nectar and flower pollen exclusively. So bees do both. Butterflies are feeding mostly on nectar. Most species are feeding on the nectar. Some do pollen. But that's from the animal's perspective, and they don't care about plant reproduction. So most people think of the interaction between plants and pollinators as this nice mutualism where the plants get to reproduce and the animal gets to eat, but actually it's a battle. Those plants are trying to get the animals to do this, and the animals are going to do whatever makes sense in terms of how much nectar or pollen they collect per unit time. Okay, so if we look at the number of flowering plants, vast majority of plants on the planet are flowering plants, and most of those use animals for pollination. And there are about 300,000 known species of flowering plant. And not surprisingly, there are about the same number of species that use flowers as a source, as a food source, so either nectar, pollen, or both. And this is giving you a representation. We see we have a bat here, we've got a small mammal, we've got a hummingbird. These are very attractive when it comes to posters. But in reality, of the 200,000 species, only about 1,000 are vertebrates. The vast majority are insects. So we have butterflies, we have wasps, and we have bees, of course. And this single bee, this is a bumblebee. In North America alone, this represents 4,000 different species. Okay, so we think of bee and honeybee, and it's one thing, because honeybees are one thing, one species. But in bumblebees, there are 50 species in North America alone. You know, hundreds of other, and I said 4,000 total. So it's much more complicated than, or there's much more diversity than we're led to believe. And we have to pay attention to that diversity. Why? Because there isn't a single animal on this side that can pollinate everything on this side. Similarly, there isn't a single plant species on this side that could supply food for everything on this side. And what we get then are these pairings. So bumblebees, for example, will visit a subset of things on this side. Butterflies will visit another subset, and there's some overlap. But those interactions between all of the animals and plants, that subset is called a pollination system. So again, we don't want to talk about pollinator as just the animal, because the plant is just as important, right? The animal is depending on the plant for food, and those plants are depending on the animals for reproduction. And so the two go together. And that's why I prefer, especially in an ecological context. In an agricultural context, it doesn't matter as much, because we've got crop plants that we've manipulated and we're planting, and we're sort of caring for them. We've taken the plant out of the equation. But in an ecological context, that plant is just as important as the animal. Those two together, and we'll see in a minute why it's so important, but those two together are maintaining ecosystem function and biodiversity. So we really need to pay equal attention to both. If we look at some of the pollinators native to North America, as I said, we have 4,000 different bee species, and they come in a variety of sizes and shapes. Some of them are very small, some of them are metallic. They're beautiful. If you have anything in bloom, you're going to see something visiting it. Carpenter bees, these are the ones that are drilling holes in your deck, causing a nuisance. There are 33 different species of those. I mentioned the bumblebees, 1,200 species of mining bee. We have a lot of moths and butterflies that have a match. There are native plants that rely on butterflies for pollination, for their survival, for their reproductive output. There are a lot of fly-pollinated plants. So in that context, the fly is just as important as the bee. The bees don't visit those plants, flies do. And then we have our one vertebrate in Eastern North America, the hummingbird. But we do have a lot of plants that are hummingbird pollinated, that are primarily hummingbird pollinated. And so even though there's just one species, there are a lot of connections with other plants, and there's a lot of overlap. So when we look at this collectively, these systems, we can think of them more like a spider, like a network, right? That everybody is connected in some way. And you can certainly have some animals that do pollinate to some degree, but there's another animal that pollinates. It's a more efficient pollinator. And the plants are targeting their most efficient pollinator. And so we need to think about those connections. What is the plant? What is its most important pollinator? And then flip it and think about the pollinator and what it likes to eat, what are its food sources, and put those together when we think about pollinators in an ecological context, or the idea of pollination systems. So to give you an example of some pollination systems, here's a bumblebee pollinated system. You can see here the female part of the flower. In this flower, a penstemon flower, the male, the pollen gets deposited on the back of the bee. And why is that? Again, we turn things and look at it from the plant's perspective. The bee wants the pollen. And so you'd think, oh, well, if the bee wants the pollen, why isn't it deposited in a place that's easy for the bee to get? The plant deposits on the thorax because it's very difficult for that bee to groom the pollen off. So it's maximizing how much pollen is getting transferred to another plant, the flower of another plant. So, you know, the plants give up some pollen, but they're trying to minimize how much they give up. So they make it difficult for the bees or other animals to get the pollen, and they try to position the pollen in a place that maximizes that transfer. This is really apparent here when we look at this hummingbird system. So here's the pollen. The nectar is located at the base of the flower, and the bird comes in to feed on the nectar, and notice that the pollen is deposited right between the eyes on the forehead of the hummingbird. And why is that? Well, if I'm a plant and I deposit the pollen on the wings of the hummingbird, you can imagine I'm not going to have very much pollen left to transfer when it moves to another plant. The female part is located up here. So as the bird moves into position, it brushes its forehead, transferring the pollen, then picks up more pollen as it then would move to another plant. So plants have I could do a whole lecture on plants and how they have adaptations to maximize this pollen transfer and to manipulate their pollinators. So bees and hummingbirds are more generalized. Here's a specialized system. So one species of fly and one species of plant. If you get rid of the plant, the fly goes away. If you get rid of the fly, the plant goes away. And you can see that the tongue of the pollinator, so the nectar is located down here. Here's the pollen. And so as this fly goes in to get the nectar located down here, we get pollen transfer taking place as it moves from flower to flower. You can see another example here. Butterflies, all the white stuff on the tongue of this monarch is pollen. As the butterfly probes into the flower, and moves to other plants and starts probing, it's transferring pollen in the process. So all of these are different pollination systems, and they're tuned to their most preferred pollinator, but certainly this bumblebee could visit, and we do see bumblebees visit primarily hummingbird pollinated flowers, and they do some pollinating. But also they may get by. So if this is a smaller bee and it crawls inside the flower, it's going to completely bypass this. So it's actually a parasite in this case, right? So it's getting a benefit, but it's having a negative effect on the plant. It's taking the reward that would have been available for its primary pollinator, and it's not giving anything to the plant in return. And so the flowers have evolved not just to attract, but also to deter less effective pollinators, nectar robbers and animals that are less efficient. And again, this hummingbird and we see hummingbirds visiting penstemon, but the pollen's deposited on the beak of the bird, and it's not very sticky. And so the pollen transfer is much less efficient. So we have all of these systems, and just to give you an example of a system, here's a bottle gentian. This is Bombus vagans, so the nectar is located at the base of the flower. And I don't have the sound on, but if you could hear it, you hear the bee going, zzz, zzz, it's vibrating to try to get those petals apart. And eventually it crawls down to the base of the flower and gets the nectar reward. You'll just see its little legs sticking up at the end of the video. There you go there. So interestingly, these flowers, they have what's called concealed nectar. And so they're primarily bumblebee pollinated, but only about 20 to 30% of bumblebees actually find the nectar in those flowers. So if we flip it back to the plant's perspective and say, well, why would plants deter or hide their nectar from 70% of perfectly good pollinators? The answer is because for those 30% of bees that actually find the nectar, there's so much nectar in there that they'll travel far and wide to go and find another bottle gentian flower. And so even though there's lots of other floral options out there, they specialize on the bottle gentian and maximize that pollen transfer efficiency in doing that. So again, the plant is really the main player here. It's manipulating the animals so that they can maximize their reproductive success. Now, obviously, there's selection on the pollinator side to become really smart, to figure out where all of this is and try to outsmart the plants. But this back and forth, that's the reason we have so much floral diversity. Floral diversity and floral signal complexity and floral complexity in general is an adaptation to get the pollinators to do, to specialize where they would generalize otherwise. And I've spent a good portion of my career figuring out, and that's where the multi-sensory integration comes from, that relationship between the floral displays, complexity and reward, and how that's the way that the plant manipulates the pollinators. And again, that's a whole other talk. All right, so I've seen, the internet is a source of information and also, I think, mostly a source of misinformation. There's this idea of pollination syndromes, and a lot of, with the plant lists that people are talking about pollinator conservation, like, oh, plant this, it'll attract butterflies or it'll attract hummingbirds. And although there are a small percentage of flower visiting animals that are specialists, that are tuned to specific traits, the vast majority are what are called generalists. And they'll visit anything that provides a good source of nectar and pollen. And so to show that, so how is it that we know that? Well, what we can do is we can bring animals into the lab and we can test to see, do they have an innate preference for color? So here's our monarch butterfly. We've got it in a harness that we release the butterfly and let it go and fly away after, so it doesn't harm the butterfly. If you touch the legs of butterfly with sucrose solution, which was that cotton swab had sucrose solution, it sticks out its tongue. It's very similar to Pavlov and his dogs. Steak and salivation, you can ring the bell and pair those two. What we do then is show the butterfly a training stimulus. And you'll notice when the butterfly first saw the yellow color, yellow to us anyway, it didn't stick out its tongue. So there wasn't this innate response to the butterfly, but when I touch the touch the legs of the butterfly, you see the tongue coming out. As soon as its tongue, let me just pause it for a second. As soon as the tongue touches that reward, the butterfly forms an association in its brain between the color yellow and reward. And the way we know that is through the testing phase. We show the butterfly different colors and we look for its response. So we saw blue. Here's a similar color, it's closer to yellow. There's no movement in the proboscis. There's no movement in the antennae. But then we show the test color and very quickly we see that butterfly looking for food reward. So this is just one way that we can test for these innate versus learned preference in these pollinating animals. Now, this butterfly, even though it has the brain the size of a pinhead, in addition to being able to find out where Mexico is without ever having done so before, which is remarkable, after just 3 pairings, that butterfly can remember that association for 2 months. And we've paired shapes and odors and color odor combinations. So these butterflies, not only can they learn things, they have a really good memory and they can put different combinations of traits together in an adaptive way. Okay. So hopefully at this point, let me just get a sip of water here. Hopefully at this point you have a sense of what a pollination system is, how we have these different subgroups. Now we're going to talk a bit about the problem. So you've heard about pollinator decline, But what you don't hear a lot about is that our native plants are declining in parallel. So we look at those two together, and what we see is that some of our native pollination systems are in decline. Excuse me, I couldn't find the mute button quickly. So let's look at bumblebees. So I've been working on many different pollination systems, but bumblebee pollination systems are my primary focus. So what I did was, one of the many good things about Massachusetts is we have good historical records going back to the early 1900s. We can look at what bumblebee diversity, what the different species look like in particular areas in the past. And then what I've done is gone to those same areas and done surveys to see how things look today. So I've been, again, doing these surveys since 2015. We've got a lot of data. And what we find so here are the species down here, and I'll talk a little bit about those in a minute. Right now, just focus on the color of the bar. So historical is blue and current's yellow. We have a few species that occur at high elevations that don't occur at low elevations. So I've split that. It's around 1,000 feet. We start to see bees like Bombus ternarius come in. And we can see for many species, so this is Bombus affinis. This is this species here, shown here. That's the first species on the bumblebee species on the endangered species list. We can see a lot of cases where there are either no yellow bars or the yellow bars are much lower than the blue bar. So we've seen a reduction historical. So this is pre-1990 versus post-1990. That's how I've divided things up. In the 90s, for whatever reason, we saw a very rapid decline in this bee, Bombus affinis, and some other bees on the list. At high elevations, we see similar patterns for the same species. So vagans, for example, occurs historically both low and high elevations, but we're seeing a reduction in both. So here are the species that currently in Massachusetts that are the social species that are in trouble. But what I want you to notice here is that we have some species where the yellow bar is much, much higher than the blue bar. And what this tells us is, and so in some cases like this bee, Bombus gricicolis, it wasn't really abundant at high elevations, but now it's one of the most abundant species that we see. So what this tells us is that while some species are declining, others have increased in abundance and actually expanded their range. So one of the biggest misconceptions out there is that all pollinators are in decline, and that's absolutely false. There are some species, for whatever reason, that are doing better than they've done historically and expanding their ranges, while others are headed in the direction of extinction. And if we expand out and look at other bees, so here are some data from New Hampshire, so Matheson and Rahan in 2019, looking at non-Bombus. And here are species that were found to be in decline. Again, they're doing very similar things, looking at historical records and current. So here it was up to 1987 and then 88 to 2016. So there are many species many bee species in general in decline. And it's not just bees, it's also butterflies. So there are 28 species, butterfly species in Massachusetts that are currently in decline, and here I'm showing you some examples. And so all of these animals are in decline, and I could give you a list that would probably take up a few more slides of the plants that are in trouble in the state. And not surprisingly, many of those plants are pollinated or match up very well with the animal species that are in decline. So why is it that this is important? So here we start to separate out the two phases of pollinator decline. The one side, and this is again, I want to stress right off the bat that both sides are equally important. This particular side, the agricultural side of pollinator decline, has received a considerable amount of attention, especially since colony collapse disorder in 2007. Now, I want you to know that almost a decade before that, we knew our native bees were in serious trouble. Bombus affinis in particular, we knew it was in decline, but it didn't get attention until colony collapse disorder hit. Why? Because honeybees play a tremendously important role in putting food in our table. And it's a multi-billion-dollar a year industry. But what I want to point out here is that the vast majority of pollinators that are involved in crop pollination, or animals that are involved in crop pollination, So honeybees are a non-native species. They're tremendously important, but they don't have a flowering plant, a native flowering plant that depends on them for pollination. There are a handful of native species that we use. This is Bombus impatiens. It's not a species in decline. It's actually the species that's becoming more abundant. So a handful of native species that are pollinating a handful of plant species that aren't really native. They may have been native at some point, but we have modified them in a way to maximize the output. And that output is the food that we eat, you know, clothing. Here are the products of pollination. So, and this is the plant community that we're talking about. Is really a monoculture, acres and acres and acres of a single thing that's in bloom for maybe 2 weeks tops. So we need a lot of individuals to do that pollination. So it doesn't matter what types of animals we have. It doesn't matter if we have 50 different bee species or one. We just need enough to do the pollination to give us the yield that we want. And that's a very important point, that the focus when it comes to pollinator decline in an agricultural context is on abundance, getting more bees into the system, not diversity. And not surprisingly, because many bees are in decline, Bombus affinis is gone or in extremely low numbers, it's never going to get this job done. So when they talk about pollinator decline, it's really how do we get more common species that are super abundant into the system, and the threatened species are being lost in the process. In fact, a lot of bees are being lost in the process, or native pollinators, because only 5% of them visit crop plants. Crop plants are not a great source of pollen and nectar. They're bred for productivity, for yield. They're not bred to provide a good source of pollen and nectar. So the focus here is abundance. So when we go into look at agricultural areas and we want to increase diversity, what that means when you look at the lists of plants that are recommended is just, let's bring in more common species to help with the pollination in case we lose our honeybees. Again, it's a very important context, but we also have to consider the ecological side of decline. So here, again, the focus is not just on the animal, like it is in the agricultural context, it's on that connection between the animal and plant, because each animal has a different connection to a set of plants. And those connections, so it's the same process, right? You've got the animal that's pollinating the plant, and the plant is providing, in the case here, it's food, shelter, and nest sites. So it's all products of pollination, but it's going to animals instead of us in the ecological context. And there are obviously, we're one species, and there are thousands of species that rely on plants for food, shelter, and nest sites. And so the diversity of connections here supports diversity on this level, excuse me, right? So the seeds that are produced are going to support birds and small mammals. And then we also have small mammal populations are going to dictate what's going on at the predator level. And so what these connections are doing is supporting the diversity in the system. So the pollinators by themselves, if we lost all of the pollinators, the animals, by themselves, yes, it would be, you know, anytime you lose an animal species is important. But when you lose an animal that's connected to a plant, and that plant depends on the animal, if you lose the animal, it has an amplifying effect and cascading effect through the ecosystem, and affects a lot more species than just the animal itself. So these interactions then are called keystone interactions, because these interactions have this positive cascading effect through the ecosystem. As we start to remove connections, either from the plant side or the animal side, assuming that it has a consequence for the plant, and we know we're losing those connections, what we don't know is where we are in the process. As we lose these connections, we're going to get to a point where there's not going to be enough food, shelter, and nest sites. We're going to lose species here, and we're going to get this massive reduction in biodiversity. We're going to get what's called ecosystem collapse. Now, people might say, well, what does that matter? You know, so we lose a few species. Why do we care? There's no dollar value associated with it. Well, in fact, if we look long term, there's a significant dollar value associated with that. Why? Because what these systems do, a healthy ecosystem, what it gives us is what are called ecosystem services. These are things like water purification, decomposition, carbon sequestration, things we get from nature for free. Pollination, by the way, is also one of them. we take them for granted, right, until they're gone. And as we degrade and we get ecosystems collapsing and massive reductions in biodiversity, these services are going to be compromised, and we're going to have to figure out a way to do it ourselves. An example is in China. They've lost all their pollinators, and so they have to hand pollinate everything. And actually, I just read an article recently that they're using bubbles to transfer pollen. So they got to figure out ways to do it, when if they had just kept their pollinators, they're very efficient. They're built to do the job. You know, they wouldn't have a significant price tag, and they still haven't figured out a really good way to do it. Animals are much more efficient than humans when it comes to pollination. In this context, as I mentioned, so this is equally important. As I said, the honeybee plays an important role in the agricultural context, but here we have to look at its role as more of a competitor, right? It's a non-native species. It doesn't match up with a native plant. And if it is competing for resources, there's a limited amount of nectar and pollen, it's going to start to affect these connections in some way. So we need to consider that. And again, I'm not saying we need to separate the two. I do feel, and I'm working with a lot of farms around the state, where you can have biodiversity, focus on these threatened species, and maintain crop pollination and honeybees. They can coexist. We just need to think about what are the needs of the threatened species, and what are the needs of the honeybee, and in terms of the pollination we need, crop pollination, and those systems will work. It's just that we're not planting things for threatened species, we're planting for the common species. We just need to shift our focus a little bit, and I'll talk about that in a second. All right, so here's an example of what I mean by pollination products and why they're important and what keystone species means. So here's milkweed, we're all familiar with that. Here's some bees visiting milkweed for nectar. We know about monarchs that need milkweed at the larval stage as food. If we get rid of milkweed, we'll lose monarchs. I want to point out that at the adult stage, flying around visiting flowers, they're generalists. So they don't just visit milkweed flowers, they'll visit any flower that offers, is a good source of nectar. Similar to what I showed you in the proboscis extension reflex video. If there's nectar, they'll learn the color, and they'll visit more flowers like that. Now, there are birds out there that like to eat both larvae and also bees. So that's what the system is sustaining there. But when these animals pollinate, we get birds are able to feed on the seeds. They're able to use the products of this pollination event for nesting material. So we're getting these benefits. In addition to sustaining the population of milkweed, we're getting these added benefits, these products of pollination that we wouldn't get otherwise. And that's what we really need to think about, because the birds prefer, just like we'll see that the bees and the butterflies prefer certain plants for nectar, birds prefer certain plants for seeds, and they prefer to use material for their nests as well, certain plant products. We need to think about everything is connected together when we think about ecology and ecosystems and ecological networks, and we have to figure out those connections, especially the threatened connections, and how we can protect and restore them. Okay, so this brings in the idea of functional diversity, and I've talked about this, but I want to introduce this to sort of drive the point home that we can look at abundance. So that's how many bees we see buzzing around. And I hear this all the time. Oh, there's bees covering this plant. And when I look at the plant, it's all one species. And so here, and it's often late in the summer, it's Bombus impatiens, which seems to be taking over definitely low elevations in many, many areas. So here we've got, and Bombus impatiens shown here is a medium-tongued species. So we've got one species, one functional group, right? So we think of functional group as short-tongued bees, medium-tongued bees, and long-tongued bees. And so there's one pollination system, right? So the medium-tongued bees are going to go with plant species that like medium-tongued bees. So that's the connection. We then look over here at diversity. So diversity is how many different species we have, right? So here we have 3 different species. So we've got increased diversity, but we only have one function group. All of these bees are medium-tongued bees. We have no short or long-tongued bees. So we still have one pollination system. We look over here and we have a bumblebee, a fly, and a butterfly. 3 species, similar to here, but here we now have 3 functional groups, right? The fly-pollinated, butterfly, and bee-pollinated plants. We have increased our functional diversity, so we have 3 pollination systems. If we look just within bumblebees, there are short-tongued, medium-tongued, and long-tongued bumblebee species. So these long-tongued bees are going to visit things similar to the butterflies. Short-tongued bumblebees are going to visit similar things to these flies. And then the medium-tongued are going to do the medium. And so we've got to think about this. And interestingly, the species in decline can all be put into this category. Now, even one of the short-tongued bees, Bombus terricola, bumblebees, it bites holes. So it likes tubular flowers, similar to these long-tongued bees, but it cheats. It bites a hole in the base of the flower and robs the nectar. And so when you look at what they prefer, they actually prefer similar things to the females do. The males then tend to, because they have short tongues, tend to do this, and they don't do the hole biting behavior. Okay, so hopefully you can see what we want to do is maximize functional diversity, not just diversity and not just abundance. So how is it that we're going to go about that? Before we get there, I just want to, again, I keep driving this point home, but I want to use different examples, and hopefully you'll see the importance here. So this is conserving pollinators versus pollination systems, right? So currently, we're using the hummingbird as an example. Here's our hummingbird feeder, and we love our hummingbird feeders. We get tons of birds, and we're feeding the birds and keeping those birds going, which is great, right? We're saving the hummingbirds. But if we have our hummingbird pollinated plants, so here's Monarda, Lobelia, and impatiens jewelweed, Patiens capensis here, that need long-tongued bees and birds, hummingbirds, for pollination. If I put out a feeder or I have a bunch of plants, what do you think the birds are going to do? They're smart, they are trying to maximize their food, so they're going to take an unlimited food source where they just come in, feed, and get out. They minimize the risk of predation, versus visiting hundreds of flowers and spending a lot of time and energy getting the nectar out of these flowers to get the same amount they could get here in a couple seconds. So the foraging preference is going to move to this direction. What happens to our native plants? Well, they're not going to get pollinated. So what happens to all of the animals that rely on the seeds that are produced by these native plants? Well, they're out of luck, right? So here's saving the animal versus saving the system, the pollination system, and the biodiversity. Now, when we introduce non-native plants, we're effectively doing the same thing as putting in feeders. Our hummingbird may love European honeysuckle, and they do, but that may be more rewarding or more preferred than our natives. And it may be that birds, and it's true that our native birds don't like seeds from non-native plants in many cases. Our butterflies do not want to use non-native plants as host plants. So we're feeding our birds, these aren't getting pollinated, populations go down, seeds go down, and everything else connected to those plants also goes down. That is why we need to focus on native plants and those connections, and rather than focusing on just planting things to get something there. We want to target the threatened species and maintain the connection between the animal and the plant. All right. So what are we doing to cause the problem, and how are we going to solve the problem? So here, first of all, what do we think is causing these pollination systems to decline? Most of the focus here has been, again, on the animal side. There's been some attention on the plant side, but not much on the connection. You've heard a lot about pesticides, which are definitely not good, especially the neonics. My lab, by the way, is studied all of these different components. I'm going to just talk about habitat change in exotic species today a little bit. But certainly neonicotinoids in agricultural areas and at your home garden is not good. It has serious consequences for the animals that ingest it in nectar and pollen. Infectious agents, so we know when we started to see native bees declining, this was the first thing we thought was causing it. We thought that there was what's called pathogen spillover from the commercial bees to native bees. More recently, there's been some studies showing that pathogens are moving from honeybees to native bees. So, all these things probably play a role, but the biggest driver is habitat change. And we're seeing that possibly climate change is playing more of an important role than we thought initially. So how is it that we figure out which one of these factors is a major driver in decline? So what we need to do is we need to shift our focus and start doing more, using more of an empirical approach. So that is going out, testing hypotheses, collecting data. And we need to do that within the context of ecology. So this is an ecological, data-driven approach. And the idea here is that all of the species, right, just like us, we have different life stages. So in the case of the monarch, we've got our larval stage where it needs milkweed, and we've got our adult stage where it's visiting anything that is a good source of nectar. In our bees, all of the bees are hibernating in the winter. Many of them come out in the spring. Some of them come out a little later. They find nest sites. They lay eggs. The eggs hatch, so we get our population increasing and decreasing, and then they go into this dormant stage. And then repeat the cycle the following year. So if we look at what they need to find a place to overwinter. They need to find a place to nest. They need to find food to be able to raise their young. They need to find mates at the end of the cycle. And then they need to find those locations again. So what we need to do then is, first of all, we need to target the species that are in trouble. And then we want to know at what life stage are we affecting? What are their preferences? What are they, how are they carrying out their life cycle? And how is it that we're affecting that component of the life cycle? And to date, people tend to think of this as one size fits all. Again, because of the importance of certain pollinators in agricultural contexts. If we find that a pesticide has an effect on honeybees, for example, immediately that's the level that we set for everything else, when we know that our native species are more sensitive, right? So, a certain dose of neonicotinoid may have no effect on honeybees, but kill half of males of a native bee species. So we need to move away from this and start to look at not at species level differences, in particular those threatened species. So to give you an example of what I call, so putting this together, ecological approach focused on those threatened species, I call that ecological pollinator conservation. And so how is it that we do that? And to give you an example, let's look at willow. Willow is by far the most important plant species early in the spring. There are when it comes to bees, nectar is their source of fuel and pollen is their source of protein. You can think of it, pollen is how they make new bees and nectar is how they're able to fly around and move. So in bumblebees, they can't live more than 24 hours without nectar, but they can go long periods of time without pollen, but they cannot make new bees without pollen. And so in the spring, if we look at male willow that offers pollen and nectar, every single threatened bee species that's out there in the spring is feeding on willow and needs willow, nectar, and pollen to get going in the spring. All of these butterflies that are at risk also need willow and other early in the spring as a source of nectar. And there are bees and butterflies that use willow as a host plant. So there's some bees that are pollen specialists on willow, and there are some butterflies that use willow as a host plant. So just by planting in willow, and there are many species, willow species, everybody thinks of pussy willow. Pussy willow gets you out of the gate, but I'll give a plant list at the end of my talk and show you that there are 3 other species of willow that consecutively bloom, and you can provide nectar and pollen for all of these threatened species for a month and a half. And so, we need to think about the plants that we put in. How many threatened species are we actually helping? It might be 0, but it might be a lot. And willow is one that definitely, we know what time they're out, what they want to eat. And so willow, that's how we observe them on willow, and that's how we know that they really like willow. And it's not just the flower. So we think about pollinators, immediately we want to have things in bloom, and certainly things in bloom are nice, aesthetically they're pleasing. But when we look at things like big switchgrass and big bluestem, these are host plants for a wide range of butterfly species. So remember, we got to remember the larval stage, maybe not as attractive, depends on who you talk to, not as attractive as the adult stage. But you'll never get the butterflies in the adult stage unless you give them the larval host plants, especially if they're specialists on that host plant, like the monarch. So we need to think all butterflies act like the monarch. So we plant big and big bluestem and switchgrass, and we've got our butterflies. The seeds of our native grasses are highly preferred by seed-eating birds. And also the native grasses tend to be good nest sites for rodents. The rodents are eating the seeds. Now you might think, so all of these are in trouble. The birds are in trouble. Grassland birds are in trouble. The butterflies that use these as host plants are on the list. But why do we have rodents in here? Well, the reason is because those rodents that are those rodent populations making nests, the rodents themselves feed threatened bird species like our owl. We have birds that also are using the larvae on these grasses as food as well. In addition, bumblebees like to, and we're doing more research in this area, but we know that there is an association between bumblebees and abandoned rodent nests. So it's possible, and again, as I said, we're looking into this, that the threatened bumblebee species prefer to use abandoned nests of a specific rodent species. And if we don't have these grasses, we don't have rodents, we're very quickly going to lose those threatened species. So again, everything's connected, and some things are obvious and some things aren't, but those host plants are just as important as the floral resources. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is shift and talk about bumblebees and what I'm doing in terms of ecological conservation of bumblebees. But I want to make it clear that bumblebees are, they're larger than some of the other bees. So it's easy to involve citizen scientists. It's easy to see them. You don't have to kill them and pin them in order to survey them. And I'm just using this as an example. But the ideas here apply to everything I talked about. All of those plant-animal interactions that I talked about, the same approach should be used. I'm starting with bumblebees. We're expanding out to butterflies and other bees. But I just want to make that clear that I'm not saying that bumblebees are the most important. I'm just saying that I've worked on this system and I'm at a point now where I can show you what you need to do. I can show you that it works. And then we can move and how we're going to expand the project, and also to try to get you interested in being involved in the ecology project. So let's start off. What is a bumblebee? Black and yellow, sometimes orange, depending on where you are. Fuzzy, quote unquote. Here's your typical bumblebee. Now you've got the abdomen, the thorax, and the head. This is the pollen, ball of pollen here. Our bumblebees come in different color patterns. So we use those color patterns to identify the species. And we have a phone app that I'll talk about that helps to walk through. So when we ID the bumblebees, we start with the abdomen and then go to the thorax and the head. The species that we have in the state. So historically, here are all the species of social bees that we had in the state. Now there are some parasitic species that I don't have here. So they were in I'm not going to get into it too much, but these are the social bumblebees. This one I just added this year, Bombus sandersoni. It was ultra rare, but for whatever reason this year, I'm seeing a lot of individuals. So it's on the sheet. I'll soon put it into the app. But you can see here the different species, and I have this sheet available that I can, as a PDF that I'll make available, and you can use this to try to see if you have some of the threatened species on your list, and I'll point those out later. I just want to give you an idea of what we've had historically in the state. So the life cycle, it's an annual cycle. So in the winter, the queens are hibernating. They emerge in the spring, and they start looking for a nest site. Once they find a nest site, they start to collect pollen. So if you see a queen with pollen, you know it's found a nest site, and that's a good sign. It lays eggs in a lump of pollen. Eggs hatch, starts feeding the larva more pollen, creates a honey pot where it will collect nectar and store it up for a rainy day. Here's the inside of a bumblebee nest. You can see this is all honey. So they do make honey like honeybees do. It's just not commercially viable. I've had people try, and people have asked me, so it's not going to go. But here are the larvae. Some of them have pupated if they look more egg-like. There's division of labor. So some of these bees are going to feed the young, some are going to guard the nest, some are going to clean the nest, and some are going to go out and forage. And those are the ones that we see. So once the queen starts the nest, she never leaves until she dies at the end of the cycle. So in the summer, right now, we're seeing all workers, although some of the species are starting to end, and we're seeing more queens and males. Queens and males mate. The mated queen finds a place to overwinter, everybody else dies, the cold weather hits, and then they start the cycle again. So you can see in this cycle, there are many points. If the queen doesn't find a good hibernation site, if she doesn't find a nest site, if they don't have enough nectar and pollen, if they don't find a mate, that's going to affect the population. At any one point, they could be, any of these points could drive decline of the population. In an agricultural context, we give them everything. We give them food, we treat them for disease, we give them a place to live. They don't need to do all this. And so that's why it hasn't been really emphasized, and that's what we're trying to change. So here's an example of, I just saw this a couple weeks ago, someone brought this to my attention. Here's a bumblebee nest in the wild. It's Bombus fervidus, one of the bumblebee species in trouble. It was in somebody's backyard. They didn't clean up their garden, so they were able to find a nest. So here are a bunch of the workers coming in. The nest is either on the surface, or I think it might be slightly underground up at the top of the screen, but they're very difficult to find. Right, so I'm working on different techniques to figure out where they are. But for this particular nest, I'm now studying it. I've got video cameras on and a whole bunch of things I'm doing to try to figure out what they're doing from day to day, what's the nest material, how many are collecting nectar and pollen, different things like that. All right, so to figure out, so what I focused on to start, so obviously all of these points are important, but what are the floral nectar and pollen preferences of these threatened species? Before I started this, the idea was this one size fits all. Well, bumblebees are generalists, so they'll eat anything. So put these plants out and they'll support populations. And that's absolutely not the case. So I'm going to show you data and how we have to change our view on things. So what I did was I had several sites around the state shown here. This is from when I started. Since that time, I've got areas in Dartmouth and different areas across the state that I've surveyed. Here's my site at Breakneck Hill. It's 40 acres. The lines are transects. So once a week, starting in May through the first hard frost, doing surveys, walking transects across the 40 acres to look at this bumblebee species. Is it a queen worker or male? Nectar or pollen foraging. These are very distinctive behaviors. What's the plant species? Different traits in the environment, weather conditions, different things. And what I found was quite interesting. So here are the results, just looking at what are they using for nectar. So results for July. So 1 month, there were 25 different plant species in bloom and that were observed to have at least one bumblebee on them. But if we look, here are the different bumblebee species here. So I've color coded the different plant species. You can see that they're using a wide range of things. The short-tongued bees tend to be using milkweed, and goldenrod, early goldenrod, right? So short-tongued bees with open flowers that don't have a long tube. Our medium-tongued bees are going for bush honeysuckle and milkweed. So we're getting some tube length in there, purple loosestrife and vetch, which is a bit longer tube. And then our long-tongued bees are doing red clover, things with a longer tube. So we do see separation based on tongue length. Again, this is the group that's in trouble. But if you look within groups, this is the most dramatic. Bombus impatiens is the same size and tongue length as these other two, but it's on loosestrife. It's visiting something completely different that can't be explained by tongue length. Similarly, we've got a lot of variation going on within the long-tongued bees. So this tells us, and I'm working on this with somebody from Cornell, it's something in the nectar chemistry that is attracting some and deterring others. I rarely, if ever, I've never on common milkweed seen Bombus impatiens. Tons of Bombus impatiens, tons of milkweed, but Bombus griseicollis visits almost exclusively milkweed when it's in bloom. So there are these very clear nectar preferences. When we look at this relationship, so here's the long-tongued bees. Why is it that they match up so well? Well, because if we look at this impatiens, this jewelweed flower, the nectar is located at the base of the spur. So you need a really long tongue to get around the bend to get the nectar down here. And short-tongued bees just can't do it. And they can't compete with these long-tongued bees, like our Bombus fervidus here that's going into the flower and it's got a long tongue. So they're very efficient on this type of flower. If we look at our short-tongued bees, so this is a male Bombus tricola, another species in trouble. And you can see that this goldenrod, you just have to walk on top of the goldenrod. It's very shallow open and good for short-tongued bees. Our long-tongued bees can't outcompete short-tongued bees. Their tongue gets in the way. So we have this separation. So you can have all the goldenrod and aster in the world, and Bombus fervidus will starve because it will not visit those plant species. It wants and is looking for things that match up with its tongue length where it's a good competitor. Now, as I mentioned, this Bombus terricola male is visiting goldenrod. The workers will compete with the Bombus fervidus and bite holes at the base of the tube, the spur down here, and cheat so they can have a short tongue and get to the nectar. And so there are these complex interactions going on. It's far more complex than I'm able to have the time to describe here. But there are these clear preferences that are emerging. When we look at pollen, just to drive the point home, here's Breakneck Hill, 40 acres, right? There is one yellow wild indigo plant right here. Here, I've zoomed in here. And what's on it? Bombus vagans, which is not in trouble to the degree that fervidus and aphanus and terricola are, but it's certainly in that direction in many areas. So one plant, we see this one bee. In the rest of this 40 acres, it's covered with bird's foot trefoil shown here. Same family, same flower shape, same flower color. I might see one vagans on all of this, but I see a vagans on one plant. It found this one plant and was all over it. So that's showing you that it strongly prefers this yellow wild indigo. And it doesn't really like the non-native bird's foot trefoil. I could give you a list, a dozen examples of similar things that I've seen. Now let's shift to pollen. Remember, pollen is needed for them to make new bees. 25 plant species, they were only actively collecting pollen on 2, meadowsweet and St. John's wort. Also seen it at other sites on native roses and sometimes on plantain. But all of the bees here would be classified as nectar or as pollen specialists. There are certain plants that they love for pollen. And so the bees are telling us, give me more of this. And so we should be putting more in. And I'm, again, like the nectar, I'm doing analysis of the pollen to figure out why does this pollen preferred by all of these bees. This also tells us that there's strong competition for pollen. Pollen is a limited resource. And when you have species in trouble, they just can't outcompete the common ones. And that's going to help to further the decline. So we need to get more pollen plants in the system. If we break things down to exotic or non-native versus native, so non-native, we can see that there are certainly some cow vetch and red clover, and I'll come back to this for these threatened species. The vast majority of plants I see fervidus on, it's red clover and vetch. When I go to a field and see these two, I expect to see fervidus. But there are other bees that, even though these are available, purple loosestrife is an easy flower to get into, but we don't see a lot of these species on purple loosestrife. We do see a lot of impatiens, the common one on purple loosestrife. And so what does this mean? So at Breakneck, here's the 40 acres. There's purple loosestrife in this wetland area down here. And what we did was 3 years ago, we removed or 3 or 4 years ago, we removed the loosestrife from this area, actively removed the loosestrife from this area. Dominated by impatiens, the common bumblebee. When we removed it, we saw swamp milkweed come in. We saw steeplebush come in. We saw Joe Pyeweed come in. And this is hot off the presses, I took this video yesterday, we saw mimulus come in. Now, fervidus and vagans are in trouble. And I know it's hard to see. This is a vagans worker on the mimulus, and this is a fervidus worker on the mimulus. I didn't see these bees on anything other than there was that one yellow wild indigo plant, and I see them on vetch and red clover. They were never in this area. With this milkweed, or the mimulus, they're now in this area, providing, so it's a good source of nectar for these bees. So a small change can have a huge impact on the threatened species, and also the connections, things that are using this mimulus plant, which wasn't here because the loosestrife is known to outcompete mimulus in areas. So you get rid of the loosestrife and you get there's a big benefit. The other thing is, if we put in native species, so what is it that they like? Obviously they like the red clover and the vetch, which are non-natives. What native species will we substitute with? How do we figure that out? Well, we go to areas that have a lot of have the species, the bee species, and also have vetch and red clover, and we put things in and see if we can pull them off the vetch and red clover. What do they prefer more than vetch and red clover? So last year, I asked somebody not to mow an area that had Prunella vulgaris, and we observed the vagans and Fervidus, and this is borealis, which is similar to this one on these two. As soon as this came into bloom, they all moved over to the Prunella. This year, Penstemon digitalis, there were fields of vetch and red clover. As soon as the Penstemon came into bloom, the bees moved over to the Penstemon. Similarly, the Monarda didyma, these long-time bees, and the hummingbirds are all moving here from here. So, so we now add these to the list, and we know what native species to substitute, and we've got all of those connections with other wildlife connected to these native plants. So native cultivars, this is some work from Annie White. A lot of people use cultivars and think, oh, it looks great to me. You know, it's really showy. It must be good for the pollinators. And you know, in most cases, it is not. It is lower quality. So what Annie White did was just looking at echinacea, but looked at the straight species in all of the cultivars. So here they're very showy, different colors, different shapes, and looked at, do the bees and butterflies prefer the native or the non-native? And here are the results. So the native is shown here in purple, and all of the cultivars are shown over here. And you can see in the case of bumblebees that in some cases they don't even visit the cultivar. Why is that? Because a lot of cultivars don't have nectar. When we breed them for show and color, all of these traits are linked together genetically. When we change one, we're altering the expression of the other. We breed for, and also the plant has limited resources. So if we take from one, we're going to pull from another, and nectar is the first one to go. And so we've been studying this extensively as well. I just don't have nice graphs and things as well documented as Annie does in terms of nectar, but here's an example from her work. Lobelia cardinalis, here's the cultivar. Here's the nectar in Lobelia cardinalis, the straight species. Here's the nectar in the cultivar. Hummingbirds love large volumes of dilute nectar. They're going to ignore this hybrid. Okay, so, and I've seen this with obedient. I've seen this with a lot of different cultivars. I've been burned many times by people telling me, yes, it's the straight species, and then I find out it's the cultivar and it doesn't offer any nectar. Lots of experiments have been disrupted in that way. So you need to ask, is this the straight species? And you need to, if you don't see anything on it, then you know you have to raise some red flags. You need to look in. You can look at the nectar, or figure out if it's a cultivar. All right. So that's, what about other things? The hibernation sites and nesting sites. We're working on both of these as well. I mentioned the nesting site work that we're doing, and for hibernation sites. So you've probably heard, don't blow your leaves and clear out your garden in the spring and the fall. Why is that? Well, in the case of bumblebees, they like to dig into the ground, and they'll dig down below the frost line, and they can be super cooled. And then, when things warm up, they come out of their hibernation site and start flying around. When we blow the leaves, we're removing an insulating layer, especially now that we're getting less snowfall, there's less insulating layer. And so we want to keep those leaves in place. And also we want to create mulch. So here's a mulch pile from the neighbor. They just always piled leaves here for like a decade. They piled leaves. And so when you cut through, you can see that you've got this transition. And I've seen bumblebee queens coming out of here in the spring. It's very easy for them to dig down into this, into these loose soils where they can dig deep and they can escape the cold temperatures. And so that's why you want to keep these areas in your back, in your gardens or in your habitats, and not blow leaves. More on this in future, because again, we're working on these two areas. Again, it's hard to find bumblebee nests, and it's even harder to find overwintering bumblebee queens. So we're trying to figure out some technology to do that. All right, so what are we going to do with all this information? Again, there are some issues that we need to address. And right now, if we look at some examples of plant lists that are out there, they don't consider threatened species, and they're not looking at things. It's sort of a one size fits all. So this is from pollinator.org. You can see they have bumblebees, and they have a list of plants, and check the box if bumblebees like it, or digger bees. I told you that Bombus fervidus and Bombus you know, some of those threatened species love clover, but it's not even checked. I also mentioned that rose is a high value pollen source. Some of these plants, the threatened species don't even visit. In fact, many of them, most of them. And so we really need to start to separate out, what do the threatened species want? You know, if my goal is to conserve, we need to target the threatened species. If my goal is just to get something in my garden that buzzes around, sure, these lists are just fine. We look at seed mixes. There are a lot of these out there as well. What do you notice? All composites, no tubular flowers, no pollen source. What are the long-tongue bees going to do that are in trouble? They're not going to touch any of this. So we need to start to tailor our list a bit more. Here is from Xerces Society. Again, this is for agricultural areas. This is a conservation cover. Well, you'd think it would help threatened species. Well, no. We look at, you know, the Zizia and lupin and indigo. Although some of these might be good, Zizia and certainly the lupin's good for long-tongue bees, only 3.5% of the mix is in the spring. 90% of the bees and most of the butterflies, I showed you that willow example, they're active in the early spring. We're never going to get our bees onto our echinacea later in the bee balm later in the season if we don't have things in the spring. The other thing that's wrong with this is it doesn't consider pollen sources. I showed you that they have clear preferences for pollen. It's not just bumblebees. There are other bees, generalist bees, that prefer certain pollen sources over other because it's better value for whatever reason. They're not on this list at all. So we need to start to change things where we think about the threatened species and we also think about plants that maximize biodiversity. An example, our native roses, Virginia and Carolina, all the species in decline like the pollen. It is also a host plant for the apple sphinx moth. So we've now got larvae that like this plant that can provide food source. The adults can provide food for our threatened birds, and the products of pollination can supply food through the winter for all of these species. Looking at pollen now, the yellow wild indigo, I told you Bombus vagans likes it, Bombus fervidus likes it, but it's a host plant for 2 of our threatened butterfly species. They only will lay eggs on the yellow wild indigo. So planting this, we helped all of these animals, plus the birds that would be eating the seeds and things like that. So it's thinking about plants that maximize diversity and specifically maximize or hit the most threatened species as possible. That's the way that we're trying to change things. So to do that, I need your help. And I need your help in different ways. So I need you to help me to collect data on these connections between the animals and the plants. And then based on the data we already have, I need you to go and to help to restore and protect habitat that has these key species that the threatened animals need, and also to put in some threatened plant species to help to restore those connections. And lastly, you know, and I guess we could look at level of commitment, assess the impact of the habitat change. So attend one of the workshops, learn how to ID different bumblebee species so you can look at what you have, you can put in plants from my list, and you can assess the change after those plants establish. And I am doing this with community gardens, partnering with community gardens, different conservation groups across the state. Lincoln, for example, the town of Lincoln, I'm doing this pre and post assessment. And they're going to make some changes in between. But you could just do all of this in your own backyard. To collect data, I encourage you to use our ecology app. I'm just going to talk about it briefly here, but I'm more than happy to take to do a workshop, to answer your questions through email, to walk you through things. I'm putting together a video, how-to video. You know, with COVID, I can't do the workshops in person, so I'm going to put together a good how-to video, and that's all going to be posted on the Ecology website, ecology.wpi.edu. So to restore and protect habitat, I've got a native plant list I can give you that separates out spring, summer, fall plants, nectar and pollen for the long-tongue bees, again, that targets threatened bees and butterflies, right? Not just bumblebees, but all the bees and the threatened butterfly species, host plants and nectar plants. In terms of the assessment, I've also got a checklist if you were interested. Most of this is pretty I think is pretty straightforward. You know, don't use pesticides and herbicides. You want to provide the nectar and pollen, so you need to start. I think the most difficult on the list would be to identify 4 species at risk that you have on site from snow melt to snowfall. That's the goal, is to get these threatened species and sustain them through the season. And so the at-risk species, again, I have this PDF. We've got, if you're at higher elevations, Terricola, Anaphanes, and vagans is up there. All of these are up there, but these 2 are more high elevation species at this point. In your area, Fervidus is the main one, and vagans, of course, we may see Aphanus and Pennsylvanicus as well. But the handout that I have, all you have to do is look for this color pattern, take a video and send it to me, and that would be a great help. You don't necessarily have to use the app, you just need to get me the video. Taking videos is much easier to identify species than taking pictures. These are not, they're photogenic, but they don't want to pose. But if you get a 10-second video, they'll move into a position where you could ID them with, you know, 95, 96% certainty. All right, so some of the success stories, what's going on this year. I've got these ecology gardens based on the plant list in Dartmouth, and this is one in Southborough. These plants, we just put the plants in the ground this year. As soon as the prunella bloomed, Bombus vagans visiting. As soon as the steeplebush bloomed, Bombus fervidus started visiting. So the success I expected it to work, but I didn't expect it to work this quickly. So I'm hoping that others will want to join and put in these plots to target these threatened species. And I know it works, so I can, you know, I was a bit worried starting with a small number of plots, but now that I know it works, and I've got some other data from other sites, you know, if you wanted to help in this way, that would be much appreciated as well. The very least, I think, I'm hope from this talk, you think of yourself as a researcher. If you really care about pollinators, pollinator conservation, and more the ecological side, you need to become your own researcher. So you want to assess your habitat, you want to see what's in bloom, what they're using for nectar and pollen, what you might want to put in, and think of it, you know, as one of these pre-post type experiments where you assess, make a change, and then do a post assessment to see that you're doing a good job. And yeah, if you, again, at the very least, you could take videos of what you see, especially, you know, if it's some plant species, a native plant species. The list changes based on data. So if you've seen Fervidus on something that's not on the list and you can document it and you've seen a lot of them on that, then the list changes. So my list changes from year to year. I just updated it a couple of weeks ago. And yeah, so it's all data driven. It's nothing set in stone. Things are going to change. Okay, so this is, if you're interested in participating, you can email me here. Because we're recording this, you can fast forward to this part if you want. Just send me an email. You could do, you could just say, hey Rob, do you want to do a survey? I think I've got some really good native plants. I think I've seen Fervidus. Can you stop by? Or you know, you could organize your own seminar, workshop. I've been doing workshops in person with small groups. I'd be happy to do those. And you know, you could submit data to the Ecology Project. And you know, if I give a workshop on this, we have a bunch of cool visualization tools. So you can look at all the data that's been collected and see what bees were in your area historically, what's been found recently. You can look at the plants that have been associated with particular species, a lot of different things you can do when the species are out. So looking at phenology, and I'd be happy to help you. We're working with a lot of schools, high schools and middle schools, to develop curriculum through this BioCS Bridge project. So if this is of interest, please contact me and I'd be happy to form a partnership. And with that said, here's a list of all the partners. Well, not all of them, a lot of them. Funding, so we've had some individuals that have been kind enough to donate to the research on the nesting, and that has yielded tremendous results. I'm very appreciative of funding from individuals, and you know, always accepting, and then NSF is funding a lot of what I'm doing as well. So with that, I would like to thank you, even though I can't see all of you. I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Rob, there are several questions that have been listed in the chat area on the
Sure.
screen. So if you can.
Oh, okay, yeah. You want me to go through?
One of them is from Stephen T. Is the decline in bumblebee numbers that you have observed more prevalent in certain parts of the country, or are your observations specifically in the Northeast? And how did you determine the decline in numbers?
Right, so good question. So the bumblebee decline is happening globally. We know there are many species in Eastern and Western North America that are declining, as well as in Europe. The other part of that question was numbers. So I know a lot of this is based on museum specimens, so you can control for sampling effort and different things. And you can look at the numbers that for a given set of surveys, you can look at the numbers, and if you survey to the same degree, you can make some comparison. The relative abundance clearly has changed. I think at lower elevations in developed areas, so closer to Boston, you tend to see this impatiens takeover, I call it, which is a sign of an area that's in trouble. So typically Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee, you know, it was relatively common later in the season, but there are areas that I'll go into and I'll see 2,000 bees and they'll all be Bombus impatiens. Whereas there were 4 species there in the same area pre-1990.
Okay, another question. Lisi Good asked, how can you tell the difference between the queen and other bumblebees visually?
So in bumblebees, the queens are, and this is true for other things as well, the queens are much larger than the workers. So when you see a queen, you know it and you can hear it. And you know, if I did a bumblebee workshop, I could show you examples, and I have pin specimens to show you the difference between a queen and a worker. But you know, a queen is could be up to 3 times the size of a worker. Males, there are tells. Each species has a tell. So the difference between males and workers, you know, in many species, the males have a yellow face, the females have a black face, and the males have a squared abdomen, whereas the females have a pointed abdomen, because that's the females sting and the males don't. And you know, this may seem difficult, but when you get a video and you slow it down, all of these traits come out. And when I point them out, you can see. The other thing is that only females, workers, collect pollen. So if you see a bee with pollen, you know immediately it's a worker. If it's smaller, it's a worker, not a male. So there are these different things that I can talk more about if I give a workshop.
Okay, great. Also from Sage Belber, what range of area are these plants for the pollinators? Are they all in New England?
Yes. So the plants and the pollinators, not surprisingly, their ranges overlap. So the bees we're seeing in Massachusetts, I say Massachusetts, but I've expanded out. And if you look at the range of the bees and the plants, it's Eastern North America. And so what we're trying to do, what's happened is that the bees and the plants have been reduced, and so there are these little islands, and what we're trying to do is reconnect everything to keep the genetic diversity up and different things. Does that answer that question?
Yes, it does. Thank you. And another question, can you talk quickly about how you remove the purple loosestrife? Just by hand pulling or what?
Yes. So we started cutting the flower heads, then we did the pulling, and this, I did not approve of this. They used the chemical, but they did spot treatments. And it looked like, I mean, I was almost in tears, and so was the person that did it. It was just this brown, last year, this brown mess. And I thought this is done for, but this year, all of a sudden we had all the mimulus came back, so, you know, and now the number's down so that they're able to pull and not have to use chemicals again. So we're working on, you know, mowing is another thing. They're definitely, we need to change our mowing practices. Mowing delays bloom times and gets rid of habitat. And so we want to do more selective mowing. But yeah, they used chemicals, and it had a positive outcome. But, you know, I'm still would rather it be pulled or do something, or use the beetle. I've been told that many areas have used the beetle and it's been very effective, and they chose to go chemical and it worked out, but in hindsight, I would have used beetle. even though the chemical worked.
Are you familiar with burnout, which is similar to that will not be named, of course, for removing everything, what you've just talked about. But burnout is approved by the organic certifiers that we use at Holly Hill Farm. So it's
so you just shoot it at the plant and it kills it?
It's a non-selective. You may have to apply it more than once. I've used it for poison ivy.
Okay.
But it's a product that is OMRI approved, so you might want to learn about that one.
Yeah, this is an area, along with the mowing, that we're working. I've got different sites that are doing different things, and again, with the chemicals, I haven't even touched that, and this was something that I just found out, last week, literally, that the mimulus came into bloom, and there was Fervidus and vagans, and so it seemed to work. But yeah, I need to on the Ecology website. I have students this year, 3 grad students starting, and they're going to be working on these things, and we're going to get more information and post it on the website.
Okay, great. One more question, or 2 more, then we probably should end. Thank you. Are there recommended easy ways to create a hibernating or nesting habitat?
Excellent question. So there are, for bumblebees, there are nest boxes available, and I strongly suggest you don't use them because they're only about 20 to 30% successful, and it's only going to help the common species, not the threatened species. So this is an area of research. This year I created my own nesting habitat, and I had a 50% success rate, and so I'm going to try it out with the threatened species, with the common species. And I've got a bunch of other research ideas that we would have started this year, but COVID, we had to delay it till next year. So stay tuned for that one. Overwintering, I would say, again, leave your yard messy. If you have a forested area, leave the leaf litter for years and let it break down. And the bees, let me put it this way. When we trick bees into hibernating, we pack them in peat, right, that keeps things moist so they don't dry out, and we chill them in the dark at a certain temperature, and that flips their program from looking for a hibernating site to looking for a nest site. So you want to have that same condition. You want a loose soil. They can dig down deep. They don't excavate their own nests, so they're not diggers by nature, but they will dig down as queens, and the looser the soil, it's easy for them to get down to the level that they need to. So I would say that's a start, but we're researching that. Next year or the year after, we'll have more to say on that.
That sounds great. That was from Jesse. And the last question from Stephen T. If you could pick one plant to put in a home garden to support both bumblebees and, I may not say this right, Apis mellifera, what would it be?
Right. So there isn't one that would help threatened species and honeybees. I guess if you're at higher elevation, milkweed, there's a lot of honeybees on milkweed, and definitely Bombus terricola prefers milkweed, but honeybees have such a short tongue that there are no nectar plants that would overlap with the long-tongued bees. But I definitely have ideas of planting for honeybees, and then others that you would plant for some of these threatened species. So I do have a system where everybody could coexist happily, the agricultural and the ecological side of things. And it would be putting in the plants that in the spring in particular. The honeybees, there's this late summer flow where literally it goes from tens to thousands of honeybees around late August. And as they start to leave to collect. So at that point, you can put in things like goldenrod, they really like. I see them all over Queen Anne's lace. I wouldn't suggest planting it. But anyway, it's a long answer. I don't think there isn't one that would cater to both. I mean, in the spring, willow, I've seen a lot of honeybees on willow. And so if I had to guess, I'd say planting willow would help. But when you get more honeybees, there's less for everybody else. So it's one of these, I don't know. I'd say willow, I guess.
Well, thank you so very much. We really appreciate your incredible knowledge, your delivery, your photographs. Of course, I want to know what kind of camera you have because your photographs are amazing. Just the knowledge that you've brought to us today is such a great beginning for many of us, and probably for some people that know more than I do, a good extension of knowledge. And we invite you to Holly Hill Farm in Cohasset. We would love to work with you on some of the projects you mentioned. So interesting and educational for our community as well, and critically important to conservation and helping our creatures. So many that you mentioned today, just in Massachusetts alone. And we look forward to working with you. And thank you very much today.
Yes, thank you. And I'll provide the PDFs of the plant list and the bumblebee ID sheet. And I will say that this extends to New England. I know it's Massachusetts, but I'm working with Rhode Island, New Hampshire, and other states, New York, and Connecticut. So
Wonderful. So we will send out